The great chamber of Nexus Prime buzzed with tension as 7 alien species gathered around the massive circular table. Jake Morrison sat quietly in the corner designated for humanity, watching the delegates argue about trilithium deposits discovered in the Kepler sector. His team of 12 humans seemed tiny compared to the hundreds of advisors that surrounded each alien delegation. Supreme Commander Thax of the Vorkan Empire slammed his armored fist on the table, making the entire structure vibrate. The sound echoed through the chamber like thunder. His red eyes glowed with anger as he spoke in his deep, rumbling voice about ancient territorial claims and military rights. The Vorkans had ruled through strength for 1,000 years, and Thax expected the same respect here that his ancestors commanded on distant battlefields. Scholar Prime. Quill of the Zephyrian Federation adjusted her crystalline spectacles and spread out holographic documents that dated back 3 millennia. Her pale blue skin seemed to glow as she pointed to various star charts and historical records. The Zephyrians believed knowledge was power, and they had spent centuries documenting every grain of space dust in the galaxy. To them, the trilithium belonged to whoever could prove the oldest claim through proper research and documentation. The Helian Commonwealth representative, Trade Minister Vex, jingled his collection of precious metal chains as he calculated profit margins on a floating display. His people measured everything in credits and cargo tonnage. Vex had already sent secret messages to local planetary governments in the Kepler sector, offering them better deals than any other species could match. The Helians knew that money talked louder than weapons or old papers. Ambassador Morrison watched all of this from his simple metal chair. Dr. Lisa Park sat beside him, taking notes on a basic tablet while observing the behavioral patterns of each species. Captain Ryan Brooks stood near the door, his hand resting casually on his sidearm, ready to protect the small human delegation if tensions boiled over into violence. The Quantum Collective representative flickered in and out of existence as it spoke, its voice coming from multiple dimensions at once. Nobody fully understood how the collective functioned, but they controlled the most advanced technology in the galaxy. Their claims to the trilithium involved complex probability calculations that made even the Zephyrian scholars scratch their heads in confusion. The ethereal dominion delegate appeared as a shimmering form of pure energy, occasionally becoming solid enough to manipulate the holographic displays. They claimed the trilithium deposits fell under ancient spiritual protections that predated all current civilizations. The ethereals spoke in riddles and metaphors that frustrated the more practical species around the table. The Crimson Syndicate leader, Warlord Krex, sharpened his claws on the edge of the table while describing how his people would defend their mining operations with superior firepower. The Syndicate believed in taking what they wanted and holding it through strength. Krex made it clear that anyone who interfered with Syndicate claims would face their legendary raiders. The Azure Alliance representative, Diplomat Zara, tried to find middle ground between all the competing claims. Her people specialized in negotiation and compromise, but even their legendary diplomatic skills seemed inadequate for this growing crisis. Zara proposed complex sharing arrangements that nobody else wanted to accept. As the hours passed, the arguments grew louder and more hostile. The Vorkans accused the Helians of bribing local officials. The Zephyrians claimed the Syndicate had destroyed important archaeological sites. The Collective warned that probability matrices showed a 90% chance of armed conflict if current trends continued. Jake Morrison stood up slowly. When the council mediator asked for humanity's position on the trilithium dispute, every alien eye in the chamber turned toward him, most showing mild annoyance at this interruption from the newest and weakest member species. Morrison cleared his throat and spoke in a calm, steady voice that carried clearly through the vast chamber. Humanity respects the historical claims of all council members, he said simply. We will support whatever decision this body reaches through proper deliberation and compromise. He sat back down without adding anything else, ignoring the disappointed looks from species who had expected humanity to take sides in their favor. The other delegates quickly dismissed Morrison's statement as meaningless political talk from a species that contributed almost nothing to galactic civilization. The Vorkans had conquered dozens of worlds. The Zephyrians had unlocked the secrets of faster-than-light travel. The Helians controlled the largest trade networks in known space. What had humanity accomplished besides barely managing to reach a few nearby star systems? Behind Morrison's calm exterior, His mind worked furiously as he catalogued every threat, every alliance, and every weakness he observed. Dr. Park's psychological profiles painted a troubling picture of species that had been forced to suppress their natural competitive instincts for centuries. Captain Brooks noted the increasing number of armed guards each delegation brought to supposedly peaceful negotiations. The session ended with no resolution as each species retreated to their private quarters to plan their next moves. Morrison gathered his small team in their modest facilities on the outer ring of the massive space station. While other delegations held emergency meetings with hundreds of military advisors and economic specialists, the humans sat around a simple table in their cramped conference room. "They're going to tear each other apart," Dr. Park said quietly as she reviewed her notes. 300 years of forced cooperation has created enormous psychological pressure. "Something has to give," Captain Brooks nodded grimly. "My security contacts report that every delegation has quietly requested additional military escorts. Some are even bringing warships to what should be peaceful diplomatic meetings." Morrison leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. 50 years ago, humanity had begged for membership in the Galactic Council, desperate to prove they belonged among the advanced civilizations of the galaxy. Now he wondered if belonging to this particular club was worth the price they might soon be asked to pay. Through the thick windows of their conference room, Morrison could see the lights of dozens of alien ships docked at Nexus Prime. Each vessel bristled with weapons that were supposedly ceremonial, but could level cities if their crews chose to use them. The age of galactic peace was ending, and humanity would need to decide where they stood when the inevitable war began. 3 months had passed since the first heated arguments over the trilithium deposits, and the situation had grown much worse. Jake Morrison walked through the corridors of Nexus Prime, noting how different everything felt compared to when humanity first arrived 50 years ago. The peaceful atmosphere of diplomatic cooperation had been replaced by suspicious glances and the constant sound of military boots echoing through the halls. Dr. Lisa Park had been working overtime, studying the behavioral changes in each alien species as tensions escalated. Her reports painted a disturbing picture of civilizations reverting to their most primitive instincts. The Vorkans had begun wearing full battle armor to council sessions, their weapons clearly visible despite regulations against bringing arms into the chamber. Their delegates spoke only in military terms now, describing every issue as a battle to be won rather than a problem to be solved. The Zephyrian Federation had locked down their research facilities and recalled their scholars from joint projects with other species. Scholar Prime Quill now arrived at meetings surrounded by crystalline barrier shields, her paranoia evident in every nervous gesture. The Zephyrians suspected everyone of trying to steal their advanced technology and had begun encrypting even basic communications in code so complex that other species needed hours to decode simple messages. Captain Ryan Brooks reported that the Helian Commonwealth had started bribing local security forces throughout the galaxy to protect their trade routes. Trade Minister Vex no longer attended meetings in person, instead sending holographic projections from heavily defended locations. The Helians had begun hoarding resources and cutting off trade with species they considered potential threats. The Quantum Collective had become almost impossible to communicate with as they shifted between parallel dimensions to avoid what they calculated as increasingly dangerous probability outcomes. When they did appear in the council chamber, they spoke in mathematical formulas that nobody else could understand, warning about cascade effects and entropy increases that would destroy galactic civilization. The ethereal dominion had started phase shifting randomly during conversations, making their already cryptic statements even more confusing. Their spiritual claims to various territories had expanded to include almost everything in known space, based on ancient prophecies that only they could interpret. Other species found it impossible to negotiate with beings who might disappear in the middle of important discussions. Warlord Krex of the Crimson Syndicate had openly threatened 3 different species during the last council session, promising that Syndicate raiders would destroy anyone who interfered with their expansion plans. The Syndicate had stopped pretending to follow council regulations entirely, taking whatever they wanted and daring anyone to stop them. The Azure Alliance found themselves caught in the middle of everyone else's conflicts, as diplomat Zara desperately tried to maintain some form of peaceful communication between species that increasingly saw diplomacy as weakness. The alliance had always succeeded through negotiation and compromise, but those skills meant nothing when other species refused to talk. Morrison called an emergency meeting of his small team in their quarters as reports came in of the first actual violence between council members. A Vorkan patrol had fired on Helian traders near the disputed trilithium deposits, claiming they were defending territorial boundaries. Nobody had been killed, but weapons had been discharged between council species for the first time in 3 centuries. The psychological pressure is reaching a breaking point, Dr. Park explained as she showed holographic displays of stress indicators for each species. They've been forced to suppress their natural competitive instincts for so long that the pressure has to be released somehow. We're seeing the collapse of artificial behavioral constraints. Captain Brooks had worse news about the military situation. Every species is quietly moving warships toward their home territories and critical resource locations. The Vorkans have tripled their fleet strength near the Kepler sector. The Syndicate is raiding civilian ships in areas where Council patrols used to maintain order. Even the peaceful Zephyrians are building defensive installations around their research worlds. Morrison made the decision that would save humanity from the coming disaster. He activated Protocol 7, a contingency plan that human strategists had developed decades earlier when they first joined the Council. The plan assumed that the artificial unity of the Galactic Council would eventually collapse under the weight of suppressed species rivalries. Over the next several weeks, humanity began quietly withdrawing from Council affairs without making any dramatic announcements. Non-essential human personnel were transferred away from Nexus Prime and other potential conflict zones. Trade agreements were allowed to expire without renewal, though humans maintained friendly relations with all species. Diplomatic communications were reduced to formal acknowledgments and basic courtesy messages. To the alien species, it appeared that humanity was simply fading into irrelevance as they became absorbed in their own conflicts. Nobody paid attention to the insignificant humans who had never contributed much to galactic affairs anyway. The Vorkans were too busy planning military campaigns. The Zephyrians were too paranoid to trust anyone. The Helians were too focused on protecting their profits. Dr. Park continued her research from remote locations, documenting how each species was abandoning the diplomatic pretenses they had maintained for centuries. Her psychological profiles showed that the pressure of forced cooperation had created deep resentments and fears that were now exploding into open hostility. The breaking point came when the Crimson Syndicate accused the Azure Alliance of secretly supporting Helian trade monopolies while publicly calling for fair distribution of resources. Warlord Krex challenged diplomat Zara to single combat during a council session, following ancient Syndicate traditions that had no place in modern diplomacy. When Zara tried to explain that the Alliance had no hidden agreements with anyone, Krex accused her of lying and ordered his guards to arrest her for treason against galactic order. The Azure Alliance security forces moved to protect their diplomat, while Syndicate raiders drew their weapons in the council chamber itself. For several tense minutes, armed forces from 2 different species faced each other in the heart of galactic civilization, while other delegates watched in shock. Captain Brooks quietly moved Morrison and Dr. Park toward emergency exits as the situation spiraled toward violence. The confrontation ended without bloodshed when Scholar Prime Quill activated a sonic disruption field that temporarily disabled everyone's weapons. But the damage to Council unity was permanent. Within hours, 3 species announced they were suspending their participation in Council sessions until proper security could be guaranteed. Morrison stood in his empty office as alien ships departed, Nexus Prime in growing numbers. The great experiment in galactic cooperation was collapsing exactly as human analysts had predicted. But nobody was listening to humanity's warnings, because they had never listened to humanity about anything important. Soon the galaxy would learn what happened when artificial peace gave way to natural competition between species that had never truly trusted each other. 6 months after the first weapons were drawn in the council chamber, the great halls of Nexus Prime echoed with angry voices and the sound of military equipment being moved into position. Jake Morrison walked through corridors that had once showcased the finest achievements of galactic civilization, now transformed into armed camps, where each species protected their territory with increasing paranoia and hostility. The council sessions had become theater of the absurd, where delegates arrived in full battle gear and spent more time threatening each other than discussing actual governance. Supreme Commander Thax of the Vorkan Empire now wore powered armor that could withstand direct hits from energy weapons, while his honor guard carried enough firepower to level city blocks. The Vorkans had abandoned all pretense of diplomacy and spoke only in terms of conquest and military superiority. Scholar Prime. Quill attended meetings surrounded by a shimmering force field that made her appear as a distant mirage. The Zephyrian Federation had become so paranoid about technology theft that they encrypted their own thoughts and spoke through artificial translators that delayed every conversation by several minutes. Their research facilities throughout the galaxy had gone into complete lockdown, refusing to share even basic scientific data with former allies. Trade Minister Vex of the Helian Commonwealth no longer appeared in person at all, instead sending holographic projections from undisclosed locations while his real body remained hidden behind layers of corporate security. The Helians had begun economic warfare against species they considered threats, manipulating currency exchanges and trade routes to damage their competitors while building massive defensive installations around their commercial centers. The Quantum Collective existed in a state of constant dimensional flux, appearing and disappearing without warning as they calculated probability matrices that showed increasingly terrible outcomes for galactic civilization. When they did manifest long enough to communicate, they spoke in mathematical formulas that predicted the collapse of organized society within standard galactic years. Their warnings about cascade effects and entropy spirals fell on deaf ears as other species focused on immediate threats. The ethereal dominion had retreated into mystical proclamations about spiritual purification through conflict, claiming that the galaxy needed to be cleansed of artificial peace before true harmony could be achieved. Their representatives phase-shifted constantly during discussions, making it impossible to determine whether they were actually present or speaking from other dimensional planes entirely. Warlord Krex of the Crimson Syndicate had stopped attending council sessions altogether, instead sending recorded messages that amounted to declarations of war against anyone who interfered with Syndicate expansion. Reports came in daily of Syndicate raids against civilian targets, mining operations, and research stations belonging to other species. The Syndicate had embraced their role as the galaxy's most aggressive faction and seemed to enjoy the chaos they were creating. Diplomat Zara of the Azure Alliance looked exhausted as she desperately tried to maintain some form of communication between species that increasingly viewed negotiation as weakness. The Alliance had always succeeded through careful diplomacy and patient compromise, but those skills meant nothing when other species refused to honor agreements or even participate in honest discussions. Dr. Lisa Park continued her research from humanity's increasingly isolated position on Nexus Prime, documenting the complete breakdown of artificial social structures that had held galactic civilization together for 3 centuries. Her psychological profiles showed that each species was reverting to behaviors that had been suppressed but never eliminated during the era of forced cooperation. They're not just abandoning diplomacy, she explained to Morrison during one of their private meetings. They're actively rejecting everything that made the council work. The Vorkans are embracing pure militarism. The Zephyrians are choosing isolation over cooperation. The Helians are using economic weapons instead of building partnerships. Each species is falling back on their most primitive survival instincts. Captain Ryan Brooks brought increasingly disturbing reports about the military situation throughout the galaxy. The peacekeeping fleets that used to patrol neutral zones have been recalled to protect home territories. Pirate raids are increasing in systems that used to be perfectly safe. Some planets are declaring independence from their parent governments because they can't count on protection anymore. The trilithium deposits that had started the crisis were now the site of open skirmishes between Vorkan military forces and Syndicate raiders, while Helian corporate armies tried to establish mining operations under the protection of hired mercenaries. The Zephyrians had declared the entire sector to be under archaeological protection and threatened to destroy anyone who disturbed their research sites. Morrison made the difficult decision to implement the final phase of Protocol 7. All remaining human personnel, except a skeleton crew of 5, would be evacuated from Nexus Prime and other potential conflict zones. Human colonies throughout the galaxy received orders to prepare for complete isolation from galactic affairs while maintaining defensive readiness. The evacuation proceeded so quietly that most alien species didn't notice humanity's withdrawal from council activities. Those who did notice assumed that humans were simply admitting their irrelevance in galactic affairs and returning to their insignificant corner of space. Nobody considered that humanity might have strategic reasons for avoiding the coming conflict. The final collapse began when the Quantum Collective detected probability fluctuations indicating that the ethereal dominion was preparing to phase shift entire star systems out of normal space-time to protect them from physical conflict. This action would disrupt local reality fields and make faster-than-light travel impossible in large areas of the galaxy. When Scholar Prime, Quill demanded access to ethereal phase shift technology for defensive purposes, the Dominion refused on spiritual grounds, claiming that the Zephyrians lacked the proper mystical preparation to handle such power. The Zephyrians responded by threatening to share ethereal dimensional coordinates with the Crimson Syndicate unless their demands were met. The situation exploded into violence when Syndicate raiders actually attacked an ethereal meditation site using coordinates provided by Zephyrian intelligence. The attack failed because the site was partially phased out of normal reality, but the attempt shattered the last pretense of civilized behavior between Council species. Within hours, formal declarations of hostility were exchanged between multiple species. The Vorkan Empire announced military mobilization against Syndicate territories. The Helian Commonwealth imposed economic sanctions on the Zephyrian Federation. The Azure Alliance found themselves caught between conflicts they couldn't resolve through diplomacy. Morrison stood in the nearly empty human quarters on Nexus Prime as alien ships departed in growing numbers, their crews preparing for wars that would consume the galaxy. The great experiment in peaceful cooperation was ending exactly as human strategists had predicted decades earlier. But nobody had listened to their warnings, because humanity had always been considered too weak and primitive to understand galactic politics. Soon the galaxy would learn what happened when artificial unity gave way to natural competition between species that had never truly learned to trust each other. The age of the Galactic Council was ending, and something else would rise from the ashes of their failed experiment in forced peace. 2 years after the Galactic Council's collapse, the galaxy burned with conflicts that showed no signs of ending. Jake Morrison received daily reports of new wars erupting as former Council species continued fragmenting into smaller factions that fought each other with increasing desperation. The Vorkan Empire had split into 6 competing warlord territories, each claiming to represent the true military tradition of their people while bombing each other's cities into rubble. The Zephyrian Federation had divided along ideological lines between progressives who wanted to share technology for mutual defense and traditionalists who believed knowledge should be hoarded to maintain their superiority over other species. Their civil war had destroyed most of their advanced research facilities and scattered their greatest scientists across the galaxy as refugees seeking protection from anyone willing to offer it. The Helian Commonwealth had fractured into dozens of corporate states that engaged in economic warfare so vicious that entire star systems had been bankrupted overnight. Former trade partners raided each other's shipping lanes while hiring mercenary fleets to protect their own commercial interests. The stable prosperity that had defined Helian civilization for centuries had been replaced by cutthroat competition between companies that no longer recognized any authority except profit margins. Even the mysterious Quantum Collective had splintered into parallel versions of itself that existed in different dimensional phases, each one claiming to represent the true path forward, while the others pursued probability calculations that led to contradictory conclusions about reality itself. Their dimensional conflicts were creating temporal anomalies that made faster-than-light travel dangerous in large areas of space. The ethereal Dominion had retreated so far into mystical isolation that most species weren't sure they still existed in any meaningful sense. Occasional reports mentioned strange energy signatures near former ethereal territories, but no one could communicate with beings who had abandoned physical reality entirely. The Crimson Syndicate had become a galaxy-wide plague of raiders and pirates who attacked anything that moved while fighting internal battles for control of the most profitable raiding territories. Warlord Krex had been assassinated by his own lieutenants, leading to a succession war that turned Syndicate space into a free-fire zone where survival depended entirely on superior firepower and ruthless cunning. The Azure Alliance had tried to maintain their diplomatic traditions, but they were slowly being absorbed by larger military powers that had no use for negotiation in a galaxy where only strength mattered. Their peaceful colonies were becoming refugee centers for beings who had lost everything in the endless wars that consumed civilization. Into this chaos, humanity emerged not as conquerors, but as the only stable force remaining in a galaxy that had forgotten how to maintain order. Morrison, now serving as chief diplomatic coordinator for humanity, began receiving desperate communications from embattled alien governments that had once dismissed human concerns as irrelevant to galactic affairs. The first request came from a group of Zephyrian scientists, whose research station was under attack by syndicate raiders. They offered to share their advanced shield technology in exchange for human protection, something they would never have considered during the Council era when humans were viewed as technologically primitive. Captain Ryan Brooks dispatched a small human fleet that drove off the raiders without firing a single shot, simply by announcing their presence and offering safe passage to anyone who withdrew peacefully. Similar requests followed from across the galaxy as species that had once considered humanity too weak to matter discovered that human ships were the only ones that could be trusted to provide honest protection without demanding tribute or territorial concessions. Human military doctrine of defensive superiority proved perfectly adapted to the new galactic environment where everyone needed protection but no one could trust their neighbors. Dr. Lisa Park established the Institute for Galactic Psychology on the human world of New Terra, where refugee scholars from all species worked together to understand what had gone wrong and how to prevent future collapses. Her research became the foundation for a new approach to interspecies relations based on acknowledging and managing natural competitive instincts rather than suppressing them through artificial agreements. Human colonies became beacons of stability. In a chaotic galaxy where their markets remained open to all species, their laws applied equally to everyone, and their military protected any peaceful settlement regardless of what species built it. Former Council worlds began requesting human administration, preferring stable governance to the chaos of their own fractured civilizations. The transformation was gradual but undeniable as humanity's influence spread through practical demonstration rather than military conquest. Human mediators resolved trade disputes that had escalated into shooting wars. Human peacekeepers protected refugee camps that housed millions of beings displaced by conflicts their own species had created. Human administrators rebuilt planetary governments that had collapsed under the weight of ethnic and ideological divisions. Morrison stood in the same chamber where the Galactic Council had once met, now serving as headquarters for the Human Mediation Service. Representatives from dozens of species gathered not as equals demanding recognition but as petitioners seeking humanity's guidance in rebuilding some form of galactic civilization from the wreckage of their failed experiment. Former Supreme Commander Thax, now reduced to leading a single Vorkan battle group, requested human assistance in negotiating a ceasefire with rival Vorkan factions. Scholar Prime Quill, her crystalline form dimmed by years of warfare, asked for human protection while she attempted to rebuild Zephyrian educational institutions. Trade Minister Vex, bankrupt and desperate, offered to place Helian commercial networks under human oversight in exchange for economic stability. The irony was not lost on Morrison as he listened to species that had once dismissed humanity as insignificant junior members now acknowledging that human judgment was the only authority they could trust. Humanity had spent 50 years being ignored and marginalized, but they had used that time to quietly study every other species, understand their weaknesses, and prepare for the inevitable collapse that their psychological models had predicted from the beginning. When the Council fell apart, humanity hadn't watched passively as other species destroyed themselves. They had watched with purpose, waiting for their moment to build something better from the ashes of failed galactic civilization. The new order wasn't based on military might, technological superiority, or economic dominance, but on humanity's unique gift for long-term thinking, patient planning, and understanding that true strength came not from forcing others to submit, but from making them want to follow. The galaxy was learning that the species they had considered least important during the Council era possessed the most important qualities for rebuilding civilization: the wisdom to wait, the patience to plan, and the restraint to lead through example rather than force. Humanity had inherited the galaxy not through conquest but through competence, and they would shape its future not through dominance but through The simple demonstration that cooperation was more powerful than competition when guided by species that understood the difference between strength and violence. The final council session lasted exactly 17 minutes before dissolving into complete chaos. Jake Morrison watched from the human observation post as centuries of diplomatic tradition crumbled before his eyes. 7 species that had maintained artificial peace for 300 years finally stopped pretending they could coexist as equals in galactic civilization. Scholar Prime, Quill of the Zephyrian Federation, was the first to formally withdraw from the council. Her crystalline form shimmering with barely contained rage as she declared that barbaric species had made intellectual cooperation impossible. The Zephyrians accused everyone else of abandoning reason in favor of primitive territorial instincts that belonged in the dark ages of galactic history. The ethereal Dominion simply faded from existence without any formal announcement, their energy forms dissipating into parallel dimensions where they could avoid the chaos of physical reality. Their departure left empty chairs and confused delegates who had been in the middle of negotiations with beings who were no longer present in any meaningful sense. The Quantum Collective calculated the probability of successful future negotiations to be exactly 0.0001%, a figure so low that they declared continued participation to be logically impossible. Their representatives flickered between dimensions one final time before vanishing entirely, leaving behind only mathematical equations that predicted complete societal collapse within 2 standard years. Supreme Commander Thax of the Vorkan Empire stood up in his powered armor and formally declared that the age of weak diplomacy was over and the age of strong military leadership had begun. The Vorkans would no longer waste time with endless debates when superior firepower could settle disputes much more efficiently. Other species could either submit to Vorkan authority or face the consequences of their military might. Trade Minister Fex of the Helian Commonwealth responded by announcing immediate economic sanctions against all species that refused to honor existing commercial agreements under the new reality of galactic politics. The Helians would protect their trade networks through economic warfare if necessary, and any species that interfered with Helian commerce would find themselves cut off from vital resources and manufacturing capabilities. Warlord Krex of the Crimson Syndicate laughed at the dissolution of the Council and declared that his raiders would take whatever they wanted from anyone too weak to stop them. The Syndicate had never truly accepted Council authority anyway, and now they were free to pursue their natural destiny as the galaxy's most successful predators without pretending to follow rules created by weaker species. Diplomat Zara of the Azure Alliance made one final desperate attempt to preserve some form of cooperative government, offering to host emergency negotiations on neutral territory under Alliance protection. Her proposal was ignored by species that had already decided diplomacy was worthless in a galaxy where only strength mattered. Within hours of the Council's dissolution, the great space station of Nexus Prime began emptying as thousands of diplomatic personnel, researchers, and support staff fled to their home territories. Ships departed in every direction, carrying refugees from the failed experiment in galactic unity back to species that were already preparing for war. Morrison coordinated the evacuation of non-essential human personnel while maintaining communication with Captain Ryan Brooks, who was positioning human fleets in strategically important but uncontested systems throughout the galaxy. These locations had seemed insignificant during the Council era, but they would provide crucial advantages as established trade routes and communication networks collapsed. Dr. Lisa Park published her final report on the psychological breakdown of Council species, documenting how 3 centuries of forced cooperation had created enormous pressure that finally exploded into open hostility. Her analysis suggested that the artificial suppression of natural competitive instincts had made the eventual conflict much more destructive than it would have been if species had been allowed to compete openly from the beginning. The galactic economy crashed overnight as currencies tied to Council stability became worthless paper backed by governments that no longer existed. Planets that had relied on Council protection found themselves defenseless against raiders, separatist movements, and ambitious neighbors who saw weakness as opportunity. Trade routes that had carried vital resources between star systems for centuries became battlegrounds as the Vorkan Empire and Helian Commonwealth fought for control of commercial corridors. The Crimson Syndicate launched raids against Zephyrian research stations, stealing advanced technology that they sold to the highest bidders. The Azure Alliance found themselves caught between multiple conflicts, their diplomatic skills useless in a galaxy that had abandoned negotiation. Systems that had never known war suddenly faced invasion as the Vorkan military machine began expanding beyond their traditional territories, claiming they were bringing order to chaos through superior organization and firepower. Planets that had prospered under Council protection were forced to choose between submission to Vorkan rule or destruction by Vorkan fleets. The Zephyrian Federation fragmented into competing factions as scientists disagreed about whether to share their advanced technology with potential allies or hoard it for defensive purposes. Their research facilities became isolated fortresses surrounded by barrier fields and automated defense systems that fired on anyone who approached without proper authorization codes. The Helian Commonwealth discovered that economic weapons were less effective than military ones when their former customers were too busy fighting wars to maintain normal trade relationships. Their commercial networks collapsed as ships carrying valuable cargo became targets for every raider and desperate government in the galaxy. Morrison stood in the nearly empty council chamber where he had spent 50 years representing humanity's interests as a junior member of galactic civilization. The vast space that had once hosted elaborate ceremonies celebrating interspecies cooperation now echoed with the sound of his footsteps as maintenance crews dismantled the technological marvels that had connected dozens of worlds in peaceful communication through the massive windows that overlooked Nexus Prime's docking facilities. Morrison could see the last few ships preparing to depart for home territories that might no longer exist by the time they arrived. The galaxy was fracturing into hundreds of smaller conflicts, as species that had been forced together for centuries finally expressed their true feelings about each other through military action. Humanity's colonies continued, their quiet expansion into unclaimed systems, their modest fleets avoiding major conflict zones while maintaining careful neutrality with all parties. Human vessels were becoming a welcome sight to merchant ships and civilian transports because they were the only ones that attacked no one and defended everyone equally. The age of the Galactic Council was ending in fire and chaos, but Morrison knew that something new would eventually rise from the ashes of their failed experiment. Humanity had spent 50 years being dismissed as insignificant junior members, but they had used that time to study every other species and prepare for the inevitable collapse that their psychological models had predicted from the beginning.